So, what are the main ingredients of beer? Hops, this one. Water. The malt. And yeah, the barley. Oh, I think someone already said.
Would like the dandelion be like an extra?
Yeah, it's sugar. It's a sugar source. It's in our last. Yeah, we said grain or malt or the grain. Grain, water, hops, and yeast. All right. So we're gonna have to get those ingredients all together to make our beer. So where do we start? We're gonna start with heating up the water. We're gonna heat up the water. We're gonna mix it with our malted grain into a container called the mash tun. This is our mash tun. Inside this mash tun, what we are doing is converting the starches in the grain into the sugar. Why do we do that? The yeast are going to consume the sugars to produce the alcohol. If there was no sugars, the yeast wouldn't be able to survive because there's no food source. So we're going to take this grain that has a bunch of starch inside of it, along with its enzymes. We're going to mix it with hot water, get it up to a warm temperature, and then we're going to let the enzymes break that starch down into the various sugars. So we convert starches to sugars. All right? This entire process is called the mash. That's step one. That's step one. After our starches get converted to the sugars, we have to get those sugars out and utilize them. So what we're going to have to do is separate the liquid that's in this mash tun, leave the grain, and pull out the liquid. Now, what we're going to do is essentially drain, and rinse the grain. Drain the mash tun, rinse the grain to collect the wort, which then gets into our boil kettle. All right. So this second step is called the lauter. Now what's nice is that when we crush the grain, we leave the husks on that grain itself. The husks and the grain particles serve as a filter bed. So the husks help to keep the really small particles from being collected when we drain our mash tun. Now, I have it draining right into a boil kettle because that's what most of the home brewers do. But some of the big production brewers actually drain this into a different secondary container and then transfer that into a boil kettle. It's not just draining. They actually transfer the grain and the wort into that secondary container. So note the name change. We go from water and malted grain to now we have wort, which is essentially sugar water. And the main sugars that are in there is maltose, hence the name malt. This process, the mash, is going to take about an hour, maybe a little bit longer, maybe 2 or 3 hours. The draining and the rinsing adds another hour, maybe 2 hours, depends on the volumes. And then we get into the boil kettle. And at the boil kettle now, we are going to boil the wort. Now, a lot of things are going to happen during this boil. All right. The first thing that we are doing with the boil is to sterilize. We're going to sterilize that wort. We want to control what organisms are in this liquid that will consume the sugars. And we do that by sterilizing. So then when we add the yeast that we put in are the only organisms that are going to consume that sugar. Second is clarification, clarify. The process of boiling will cause some of these compounds in the wort that would produce a hazy beer to precipitate. They can congregate together, they form solids, and then we can separate it at this step. So as we transfer the cooled wort into a fermenter, we can leave all of those particles behind. So when we get to our final beer, our finished beer, it's clear. Right? Historically, people didn't worry about it because they were drinking out of opaque mugs. They're stoneware and stuff. Now, with the advent of glass, a lot of people like to see what they're drinking. So it's important. The third reason is for our hop additions. And our hop additions are added to accomplish a few different things. First thing is to add bitterness to our beer. Right? We add bitterness to the beer. Why is that important? Well, this is sugar water. That's what it is. If you were to taste it, it's sweet. It's too sweet. Yeah, some of you might argue with me, but taking some of the chocolate syrup, liquid chocolate syrup that you pour over ice cream, yeah, you can drink out of the bottle, but I don't know, I think I'd taste it once, maybe twice, and then say that I can't do anymore. This is just way too much. Same thing with this. So what we can do is offset the sweetness by adding hops to give more of a bitterness to it. The dandelions help to do that. And there's other things, other plant material that accomplishes the same thing. Now, with the bitterness, the bittering hop additions, it doesn't matter when we add it. It doesn't really matter if we add it at the very beginning of the boil. It doesn't matter if we add it near the end of the boil. We're going to get bitterness contributions. But what we do need a boil. We need a boiling wort because, as we'll discuss, the hop compounds, the bittering compounds in the hops, need to be converted. They need to be changed, what we call isomerized, to produce the bittering compound in the wort. And that's only going to happen if we're actually boiling. Right? So bitterness helps to offset the sweetness. Second thing, flavor. Adding hops not only adds bitterness, it adds all the other chemicals, all the other oils that will contribute to various flavors to the beer itself. Usually, the flavor additions are only boiled 30 minutes or less. They're not in there. If you put it at 60 minutes and boil for 60 minutes, you probably won't get much of a flavor from that hops. If you boil it at 30 minutes, you start getting some flavor. You boil for 20 minutes, you get more flavor. If you boil for 10, you'll have more flavor than that. All right, so you can get your flavor additions. The third thing, you've got these oils and compounds that give the flavor. We can also get some aroma. And the aroma additions are usually less than 15 minutes. Because the aroma, these oils, are going to be the lighter oils. Technically, they're called volatile oils, but these are the oils that can easily leave the wort. Once they leave, they're gone. So once we start boiling, the ones that are easiest to leave are gonna go first. So less than 15 minutes, we get some aroma, we get flavor and aroma. All right, so if you only wanted the flavor, you go like a 20-minute addition or a 30-minute addition. If you want more aroma, you go shorter and shorter and shorter. So you can add it at 15 minutes, at 10 minutes, at 5 minutes. You can add it right at the end of the boil. So you turn off the heat, add your hops, and at that hop, at the temperature of the wort, we're going to extract aromatic compounds to contribute to our beer. All right. How long do we boil the wort? Between 60 and 120 minutes. Depends on the beers. And there's some variations on this stuff too. But the boil, everyone basically does it. Once we boil, we are going to cool very quickly. And then transfer it into our fermenter. All right, so why is this cooling quickly important? 2 reasons. Number 1 is clarity. So we already had clarity up here. All right, there's 2 different sets of compounds. Right? They both contribute to haze in the beer. All right, they both contribute to haziness in the beer. Some of that haze only appears when the beer is cold. So if you have a beer that's hazy, it's out of the fridge, you pour it and it's hazy, so you can't see through it, and then as it warms up, it becomes clear, you've got this issue. It wasn't cooled fast enough. If you pull out a beer and it's hazy and it warms up and it's still hazy, you probably have something here. There's something in there that prevented the clarification from happening. Now again, there's exceptions. There's exceptions to all this, but I'm just trying to generalize. So cooling very quickly helps to precipitate some more of these proteins so that you can get this crystal clear beer. The second reason is to avoid contamination. Because we're at boiling. No bacteria, no yeast are going to survive that. But as soon as we get to around 120 degrees, 110 degrees, you can start having organisms dropping into that wort. They might not be actively working at that temperature, but they're now there. All right? So what we want to do is cool it very quickly to get to the temperature that we're going to ferment the beer, or that wort, so that we can add our yeast. So we've got ingredient 1, ingredient 2, ingredient 3, the hop additions, and ingredient 4, our yeast. What's happening here? We are converting sugar to ethanols at this point. All right, so we want to control what organism does this. And we do that by cooling down, by boiling to sterilize, and then cooling very, very quickly. Our temperature range depends on the yeast. Yep, temperature depends on the yeast strain and what we're trying to brew. All right, typically, we're going to have ales are going to ferment anywhere from about 65 degrees Fahrenheit up to maybe 76 degrees. Whoops, Fahrenheit. 76 degrees Fahrenheit. Lagers are going to ferment usually 48 degrees Fahrenheit up to about 58 degrees Fahrenheit. And we're going to talk about the effective temperature on the yeasts. It's partly some of the topics, but there's a reason. These yeasts are adapted to various temperatures. All right. If we try to ferment at a temperature that is not beneficial or not good for the yeast, then we're going to produce off flavors. And that's not what we want, because we've selected the grain, we've selected the hops to produce a specific flavor and aroma profile. We assume that when we put in our yeast that we're going to get a known profile from that yeast too. So the brewer, as like an artist, has this idea in his mind. This is how I want it to taste. This is how I want it to smell. If we don't keep within these temperatures, the yeast start contributing flavors that maybe you don't want in that beer. So then the brewer brews it and says, this is not right. I don't like this. Let's get it done. All right. So we're going to ferment. We're going to convert the sugars to ethanols. And then at the end, as the sugars start to run out, the yeast will recognize that there's not enough food, and they will start to fall out of solution. All right, they'll fall out of solution, start leaving a clear beer for our next step. So our next step then will be the packaging. Now, while we're here, when the yeast, or while we're fermenting, as we're near the end of the fermentation, we have an optional addition. So we have the opportunity to add more hops to our fermenting beer. Now, you typically don't add it while the beer is actively fermenting. Why? Because this addition is all about aroma. This is called dry hopping. This is called dry hopping. We put the hops in dry into this wort. We want those aromatic compounds. Those are the easy ones. Those are the ones that will come off the beer very easily. If we put it in while the yeast is producing this ethanol, all right, it's a lot of bubbles. They're outgassing a lot of CO2. The CO2 will take all that aroma out with it. Yeah, we lose some of those aromas during fermentation. These add them back, and it really increases the amount of aroma that we get from the hops themselves. All right, and we would do that before packaging. Now, with packaging, we've got a couple different things. We can bottle, we can keg, we can age it. We can move into wooden barrels, into casks, and age it that way. We're not really going to spend much time on this packaging side of things. We're going to focus more on this step all the way through to our yeast. And then, once we package it, the last thing, presentation. So we will have a presentation on glassware. So we're not really going to focus on packaging. When you get of age, go tour a brewery and ask questions. Ask questions of it. 01 Ale House brews, they're right downtown. Saturdays they do tours. Horny Toad Brewing Company out in Rowena will do tours. That's a small place. They're open on Saturdays. All right. Questions on this process? Yep.
On the fermentation part,
Yep.
on the videos, they have some other liquid coming from the pot, which is supposed to sterilize it more.
Oh, they had an airlock?
I don't know.
Probably.
It was like a clear liquid that was like had bubbles coming out of it.
Yep. Yeah, so this is sugar to ethanol. We're going to talk about it. The yeast are going to take sugar and they're going to produce the alcohol, but in the process, they're going to make carbon dioxide gas. All right. So in the presence of oxygen, the yeast, they don't produce the ethanol. Instead, they use the oxygen. Energy production is more efficient in the presence of oxygen. So they're using the energy, they're just reproducing. They get up to high numbers, and then when the oxygen runs out, then they switch to this. So what we do with the fermentation is to get it into a sealed vessel so that no oxygen can get in. So the yeast undergo the reproduction, use up the oxygen that's already there, and then as soon as they use it up, they should be at a large enough population size where they can convert all the sugars that need to be converted into ethanol, and it's releasing all that CO2 gas. It's gonna raise up. CO2 is gonna come off. So I do have that. So I brewed on Sunday. I brewed 10 gallons of an Oktoberfest, and I've got my buckets. They're actually in a chest freezer. All right, the chest freezer is holding the temperature at about 55 degrees. That chest freezer is filled up with CO2. You stick your face, you open the lid, CO2 is heavier than air. You open the lid, you stick it down. Yeah, you can go out pretty quickly on that. Unfortunately, I have a fan in there, a circulation fan, so I open up the lid and CO2 comes out quickly. But yeah, they have an airlock up there so that it's only one way. Gas can get out, nothing else can get back in. All right, so we're going to go over this. What we're going to do is start with the grains, with the malted grains. What is a malted grain? Why is it important? Why does it have to be malted? Can we just go down and pick barley off the crop and use it? Short answer is yes, we can. Will it make good beer? No, it won't. All right? So we'll talk about the grains, and we'll talk about the different types of grains and the specialty grains. We have a demonstration where you'll see the effect of various grains, and it's not alcohol, it's sugar water, but if you wanted to, you could taste that sugar water and get some of the flavor contributions. We'll talk about the mash and how temperature of the mash will affect the final product of the beer. All right. We'll talk about, not so much the boil, we'll talk about the hops, the hop additions. Like when do we add them? What are we doing? We'll talk about the variety, and we have a demonstration on hop flavor. Or I'm sorry, not flavor, hop aroma. So we'll see, to give you some hops, and we'll try to see, can you get those specific characteristics? Do you smell grapefruit? Do you smell the pine of it? And so forth. We'll have that demonstration. Then we'll talk about the yeast. We'll talk between ales and lagers, right? What's the difference between them? And we'll talk about how temperature can be used to manipulate the final product of the beer. So we can do everything exactly the same. Take the exact same ale yeast, ferment one at 65 and ferment the other at 76, and we will have two different beers. Yep.
Do you end up saying how long it takes for the ferment?
I didn't say it. It's gonna depends on ale versus lager, and also depends on the brew house that's doing it. So ales will take a shorter amount of time because they're at a higher temperature. Rule of thumb, it could be anywhere from 5 days up to maybe 2 weeks. Also depends on how strong about a beer you're making. The lagers traditionally are going to take much longer. So the fermentation process would be a minimum of about 10 days, 7 to 10 days. Usually it's 2 weeks. And then you start the lagering phase, which is getting it even colder so that it ages. And if you do it correctly, the yeast haven't quite finished up, so we're dropping the temperature gradually, and they're slowing down, and they're kind of finishing up the process, and that's going to add like another week or two. And then you age it. So yeah, it can take some time. So we'll talk about the yeast, and then we'll do, yeah, as I said, presentation. Talk about some glassware, because again, it's the art. We're trying the brewery, the brewmaster's trying to present his creation, and he's trying to present it the best way we can. All right. All of this, you can do searches for YouTube, and you can see people demonstrate it on their systems. If you're curious, and this is what we're doing. We're going to talk about this. All right. Questions? All right. We're done for the day. Don't forget, check your syllabus. Let's see what's due.